Following a delivery of new parts, I was able to make some finishing touches to the control room, adding the decorative border, computer monitors, and filling in the dark red flooring. Returning to the lab, I began by looking at the incubator and what I could use to build it, as my first attempt was a little small and I couldn't really fill the centre in. With the incubator being circular in shape, I began with the most circular Lego shape, the wheel. I didn't really want it to look like a wheel though, and it needed to be a suitable size, so my selection range wasn't too big. I wanted to pair the wheel with a simple round plate for seating eggs on, but this didn't quite sit right on my first two selections. I thought I could maybe seat the eggs on a pulley wheel instead, but this was a little too narrow. After testing a couple more shapes, I stumbled upon a part that had been recently released. It was a little more flat-sided than the incubator in the movie, but I felt it was a good fit. With the incubator in place, I was able to begin fitting things in around it. I widened the embryo storage out enough to install a door, then put a temporary floor and worktop in the lab. Before I could install a second wall, I had to set up some of the system that would drive the mechanical arm, in order to see where the wall could be placed. I did have to shift things over a stud, but I didn't think it was much of an issue. I was now able to fit in a second wall to separate the lab from the door mechanism, but I also added in some extra filler and adjusted the height of the walkway and embryo storage. However, filling in more of the mechanics showed up an issue, as one particular gear wouldn't quite fit underneath the new wall. I'd also forgotten part of the frame for the robot arm, so I had to make a few adjustments before moving on. I now had a rough layout planned, but the floor was supposed to be two colours, so we tore up the temporary plates and got to work piecing together the shapes needed for the split floor. I still didn't know what to do about that red stripe. I didn't like that the wall in the lab was taller than the wall in the control room, so I reduced the height of the windows to bring it in line, then made some adjustments to the corner so I was happy that the wall looked even. Continuing the lab design, I realised that I could probably get away with reducing the width of the walkway to 3 studs rather than 4, allowing for another stud depth to be added to the lab. It was a bonus that I actually preferred the new look to the old. You may remember I've previously been struggling to create a red stripe across the floor. Well, I've finally cracked it, by using triangular tiles joined by their adjacent sides. It was maybe a little thicker than I wanted, but it was good enough. Unfortunately, I didn't have any red tiles available, but I had some sand green plates delivered, so I was able to lay out the rest of the floor. You might well have noticed here that I've changed the mechanism for driving the robotic arm. The new system takes up less floor space, allowing me to build the lab wall closer to the door mech. There was, however, a possible issue with the new lift arm colliding with the wall I was building. I wasn't sure whether it was actually restricting movement, so I kind of kept it in the back of my mind while I carried on building. One possible solution would be using a panel rather than a brick to provide some extra space, but I also thought that the slightly wobbly connections could be causing the lift arm to spill over further than it should, so I rebuilt the arm to see whether that would have any effect. It didn't really, but at least it was less wobbly. In order to continue building up the wall, I needed to lay down a foundation for the embryo storage and its connection to the walkway. A simple straight continuation of the line of the curved bricks was too wide for a plate to sit on, so I brought the curve back on itself to create a narrower foundation. I could now lay the walkway connecting the narrow passageway to the embryo storage, although I had to lengthen the original walkway by a couple of studs to meet up with the new one. The back wall was now at the right height for placing windows. Annoyingly, I didn't have the right length brick here, which screwed up my joint pattern. Terrible. I'll have to come back and fix that another time. With the walkway to the embryo storage in place, I now wanted to get the small curved staircase up to it in position. Fixing the wedge plates where I wanted them presented the same challenge as my first stripe design, as none of the studs on the steps lined up with the studs on the floor. At least not in a way that would create a uniform staircase. Thinking back to another MOC I built, I used hinged plates to join together wedge plates in a spiral, then simply rested them on tiles, so I figured that would probably be my best bet here. This meant swapping out several of the plates beneath the staircase, but that was a simple enough task. Now strictly speaking, most of the windows around the lab are blue in colour, but I felt at the time that looked a little toy-like. I may well revisit this looking back at it. After filling in some details and making a few minor alterations, I arrived at a small alcove left under the walkway. I really didn't want to just leave this as an empty space, and I recalled the scene in the maintenance shed and how a number of cables and pipes ran through the corridors, so we installed a few Technic tubes, which looked pretty effective. My next session began with adding the finishing touches to the stairs, using pneumatic T-pieces to create a handrail. I also installed some inverted slopes to support the workbenches, and a panel by the robotic arm mech. As I'd done with my Steamboat Willy build, I wanted to be able to drive this build from the rear, but I wasn't sure how to build a discrete system that wouldn't interfere with the wall behind the shelf, but I could also attach a motor to. There was also a minor problem with an L-shaped lift arm preventing me from building any wall around the border, but this was quite an easy fix using only 2 connectors that just hadn't occurred to me when first building. I had initially intended on boxing in the whole mechanism, but I felt a bit like with all the effort I'd spent on it, I kind of wanted to show it off, even if it isn't particularly pretty. I did still opt to build a low wall around it, which tapered down in height from the taller lab wall. The outer lab was looking pretty good right now, but a lab isn't much of a lab without any equipment, so it needed some scientific gizmos and doodads to complete the look. There's a scene in the film in which we see a scientist drilling into a piece of amber to extract DNA from a mosquito. I knew that I had at least one brick with a mosquito printed on it in my possession, so I had to include this. Now, due to the relative sizes of Lego parts to minifigures, I had to take some liberties here, designing the drill as a desktop machine rather than handheld. I did my best to make it appear mechanically operational, with arms and a wheel for manual adjustment. Obviously, no laboratory would be complete without a microscope. This was a relatively simple build, though I had to go through a few accessories to find the right eyepiece.